When we talk about the psychology of attraction, particularly from a male perspective, we often forget the role absence plays in shaping value. It's easy to assume that emotional attachment comes from prolonged presence, constant closeness, or frequent communication. But in truth, one of the most powerful triggers for a man to fully realize the depth of his feelings is loss, or more specifically, the quiet, dignified absence of a woman who once chose to be close to him. You see, the male psyche is naturally geared toward challenge and conquest, not necessarily in a predatory sense, but in the archetypal structure of how value is perceived. What is earned is cherished. What is freely available without cost often fades into the background. So when a woman walks away, not out of spite, not in the heat of an emotional breakdown, but with calm, intentional distance, it creates a psychological rupture. Suddenly, what was once taken for granted now becomes sacred. He begins to reflect, and this is critical. Men often do not reflect deeply when they are emotionally comfortable. Familiarity can dull perception. But when she removes her presence, when her voice no longer shows up in his messages, when her laughter is no longer part of his daily rhythm, something awakens in him that was previously dormant. A recognition that he didn't fully grasp what he had until it was no longer his to reach for. This isn't just romantic idealism, it's rooted in something deeper. In psychological terms, humans assign value through contrast. We appreciate warmth more after we've been cold. We savor peace more after conflict. The absence of something once emotionally significant activates a space in the mind that starts to reframe memories. The brain begins to romanticize, to idealize, not always in a distorted way, but in a clarifying one. Moments that seem small become meaningful. Words that were overlooked now seem profound. He begins to see not what she was, but what she meant. And this meaning hits harder when the separation was initiated by her, especially if it was done with grace. Because then it's not just about loss, it's about choice. She chose to step away. She didn't beg, she didn't plead, she didn't force him to understand. She simply exited, leaving behind not noise, but silence. And that silence speaks louder than anything she could have said. In that silence, a man has to confront not only her absence, but his inadequate presence, the things he ignored, the ways he failed to engage, the walls he built, and most importantly, the realization that love doesn't always wait, that a woman who values herself enough to walk away is a woman worth mourning, and perhaps, if life allows, a woman worth fighting to return to. There's a reason why some of the most enduring regrets men carry are tied to the women who left, not because of chaos, but because of clarity. Because those are the women who didn't just disappear, they held a mirror up before they went. A mirror that said, this is who I was, this is what I gave, this is what you didn't see. And once she's gone, he sees it all in painful detail, in slow, creeping ways. So why do men fall harder for women who let them go? Because letting go, when done from a place of strength, not bitterness, isn't an act of dismissal. It's a revelation. It reveals who she truly was and who he truly failed to be in her presence. That kind of revelation changes a man, not just in how he sees her, but in how he sees himself. Sometimes it's not her love that opens his eyes, it's her absence. And by the time he finally sees her clearly, the image may only remain in memory. When a man is let go by a woman, he still values, even if he doesn't fully realize it in the moment, there's a deep psychological shift that begins to unfold. And it often starts not with sadness or longing, but with something far less romantic: ego. The ego is a tricky thing. It acts like a shield, a filter through which reality is distorted to protect one's identity. So, when a woman walks away, especially without creating chaos, it doesn't immediately trigger a man's vulnerability, it triggers his pride. His internal voice might say things like, she'll be back, or she just needs time. He doesn't want to admit that he was let go because that would mean confronting the uncomfortable truth that he may not have been enough, or worse, that he didn't recognize her worth until it was too late. This is where the real confrontation begins, not between two people, but within himself. Because the question that emerges in the quiet aftermath of a dignified goodbye is not about her behavior, but his. Why didn't she chase me? Why didn't she fight for this? That's the ego speaking, not love. That's the part of him that still believes he was the one in control. And when that control disappears, when he sees that she was strong enough to walk away rather than cling, he's forced to face a hard reality. He was not as powerful in the dynamic as he thought. Now, here's the deeper truth. Most men don't respond to emotional absence with clarity at first. They respond with confusion, even resentment, because this loss isn't just a relational loss, it's a blow to identity, especially if the relationship was something he subconsciously thought he could take for granted. When a woman walks away with composure, it sends a message that pierces the male psyche. I don't need you to be okay. I choose to walk away because I see more value in my peace than in your inconsistency. And that hits hard. It's in this rupture that transformation can begin. But only if the man is honest enough to drop the defense mechanisms. If he holds on to his pride, he'll likely numb himself, surround himself with distractions, or try to prove he never needed her. But if he pauses, reflects, and allows the pain to teach him, he starts to see the story differently. He begins to remember the subtle warnings she gave, the moments she went quiet, the times she tried to connect emotionally, but he shrugged it off. The little expressions of unmet needs that he minimized. Suddenly, her departure is no longer a shock, it's a consequence. And when a man understands that, truly understands it, he begins to change. Not to win her back necessarily, but because something deeper has been awakened. A recognition that his behavior, his detachment, his emotional unavailability played a part in her leaving. That realization humbles him, and from that humility, emotional growth becomes possible. The irony is this: men often fall hardest when they are no longer being chased. When a woman detaches, especially with strength and integrity, it challenges the ego in a way nothing else can. It doesn't spark dominance or control. It initiates self-examination. And for many men, that's the very thing they've been avoiding all along. In the end, the man who was once sure of his grip is left with a haunting thought. She didn't leave because she stopped loving him. She left because he stopped seeing her. And nothing confronts a man's ego more powerfully than the silence of the woman he thought would never walk away. When a woman lets go, especially without dramatic flair or emotional collapse, what she's actually communicating is an unspoken mastery of boundaries. And this does something profoundly unsettling to a man, not in a harmful way, but in a way that confronts his deepest assumptions about love, power, and worth. Because what she's saying, without needing to say it, is, I value myself enough to leave where I'm not valued. And that single silent declaration can echo in a man's mind louder than any argument or plea. Most people underestimate how psychologically impactful it is when someone detaches with grace. We're conditioned to expect breakups to be messy. We anticipate shouting matches, guilt trips, or drawn-out emotional tension. But when that doesn't happen, when a woman instead creates space without vengeance, it forces a man to look inward. There's no noise to deflect from, no emotional chaos to blame. Just the quiet realization that she chose to uphold her dignity, even if it cost her something emotionally. And that's when her value skyrockets in his eyes. You have to understand something fundamental about the masculine psyche. It's wired to recognize strength, not only in dominance, but in restraint. A woman who walks away, not because she's weak, but because she's strong enough to walk without needing closure, challenges that wiring. She becomes unforgettable, not because of drama, but because of discipline. That kind of woman leaves a mark because what she teaches through her behavior, not her words, is that love should never require self-abandonment. She demonstrates that caring deeply doesn't mean tolerating carelessness. And most men, when they're honest with themselves, know when they've crossed a line or taken someone for granted. They just rarely expect there to be consequences that are calm, composed, and final. That's why they fall harder for the ones who let them go, not with hate, but with honor. That's also where memory starts to work differently. When someone leaves in anger, we remember the anger. But when someone leaves in silence and self-respect, we remember the reason. We replay it. We obsess over it. We search for meaning in the spaces where conversation used to be. And for a man who once thought he held the upper hand in the relationship, that introspection can be brutally humbling. But it's also where genuine transformation begins, because now he's not just missing her presence, he's confronting why her presence felt so stable, so warm, so grounding. And that stability, ironically, only becomes obvious in its absence. Her emotional discipline, her refusal to beg, to manipulate, to self-sacrifice, becomes the very thing that elevates her in his memory. The question, then, isn't whether men fall for women who let them go. That's already answered by countless poems, regrets, and sleepless nights across history. The real question is why, and the answer lies in value recognition. When a woman walks away with her value intact, it reframes everything he thought he knew about her. She stops being just another person he dated and becomes a standard by which all future experiences are measured. And that standard, it lingers, it shapes how he sees relationships moving forward. It sets a bar, not because she asked him to meet it, but because she walked away when he didn't. That's a different kind of power, a quiet power, the kind that doesn't scream but is never forgotten. In the end, it's not just her leaving that makes him fall harder, it's the kind of woman she revealed herself to be by walking away. And that kind of revelation doesn't fade. It deepens over time until her absence feels more profound than most people's presence. When a woman chooses to walk away, she often enters a space of stillness. Not apathy, not coldness, but a calm that comes from deep internal resolution. That stillness doesn't mean she doesn't feel, it means she's no longer reacting. And for many men, that shift in energy is more jarring than anger or tears. Because as long as there's reaction, there's still some form of emotional currency being exchanged. But when the reactions stop, when the woman is no longer trying to explain, fix, or argue, what's left is silence. And silence is the loudest mirror a man can face. In that silence, he sees the consequences of every missed opportunity to connect, every moment where presence was replaced with distraction, every time she reached out emotionally and was met with indifference. He begins to see that love isn't sustained through grand gestures, but through the everyday decisions to stay emotionally engaged, to truly listen, to be available, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually. What unnerves him most is that her silence doesn't feel empty. It feels full, full of meaning, full of truth, full of boundary. And that's what many men miss until it's too late. A woman doesn't go silent to punish. She goes silent when she's finished negotiating her worth. That's a level of finality that words can't always carry. It's the embodiment of self-worth. And it's precisely that embodiment that begins to reshape how he sees her. You see, men often misread emotional endurance. They mistake a woman's patience for dependence. They see forgiveness as fragility. But when she removes herself without drama, when she stops pleading, stops explaining, and simply detaches, her strength becomes undeniable. That's when the narrative shifts. He doesn't remember her as the one who tolerated him. He remembers her as the one who refused to lose herself in the name of love. This reflection, though painful, is essential because it forces the man to recognize not just the value of what he lost, but the reasons behind the loss. That's where the emotional weight begins to settle. He can't project blame outward anymore. The absence has become a teacher, and it teaches with precision. Her stillness becomes a source of discomfort because it reveals a truth he tried to avoid. She was always serious. He just wasn't listening. In this process, there's a kind of awakening. He may start to see her with new eyes, not through the lens of nostalgia, but through the lens of awareness. She becomes less of a fantasy and more of a symbol, not of pain, but of integrity. And that integrity, now that it's out of reach, becomes magnetic because it's rare, because it was real, because it required strength to carry it so gracefully. And the irony is this: he might have stayed if she had kept giving more, kept trying harder. But it was her refusal to keep giving in the face of disrespect that ultimately made her unforgettable. Her absence spoke with a clarity his presence never could. And the emotional contrast it left behind, that becomes a haunting echo. So when you ask why men fall harder for women who let them go, understand this: it's not the leaving alone that shapes them, it's the way she left, with silence instead of noise, with dignity instead of demand, with strength instead of surrender. And that kind of goodbye doesn't close a door, it leaves a permanent mark. When a man is truly allowed to experience loss, when a woman lets him go without clinging or chasing, it forces him into a confrontation with himself that is far deeper than most realize. Not because she was cruel or because she punished him, but precisely because she didn't. There's a profound psychological shift that happens when someone leaves and doesn't try to convince you to stop them. And what's most startling about this experience is that it doesn't just feel like rejection, it feels like reflection. He begins to see himself more clearly, not as he imagined himself to be, but as he was in the relationship. And here's the uncomfortable part. Many men realize that the version of themselves they offered wasn't worthy of what they received. That's a brutal truth to sit with. It's easy to say, she left. It's much harder to say, she left because I wasn't showing up the way she needed, and she finally honored herself enough to walk. This moment of realization is often delayed. It doesn't always strike the day she walks out the door. It can take days, weeks, even months. Because initially, there's pride, there's ego, there's distraction, but eventually when the noise quiets and the distractions fade, the emotional accounting begins. He starts to replay conversations, remember her expressions, her efforts, the subtle signals of exhaustion she showed, and with that memory comes regret, not for being left, but for not seeing clearly until it was too late. And this is where the deeper psychological mechanism comes into play. In the absence of her presence, he has to reconstruct the meaning of the relationship on his own. And he starts to realize just how much he didn't fully understand her while she was there. That's the paradox of loss. It often clarifies what love obscured. Her grace in leaving becomes the very thing that allows him to see her dignity. It's not revenge, it's revelation. The absence of her voice becomes a kind of moral teacher. It exposes all the shortcuts he took emotionally, the moments he could have been more present, the times he used silence to win arguments instead of to reflect. Now he sits in that silence, but it belongs to her, and it's not his to interrupt anymore. That kind of silence can't be filled with rebound relationships or late-night texts. It lingers in a man's psyche because it speaks to something deeper, the fear that he might not find someone who saw him with such depth and still chose him until he gave her no reason to stay. And so what starts to emerge within him, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, is a form of reverence, not idolization, not obsession, but a grounded respect for her strength. He starts to understand that her leaving wasn't an act of abandonment, it was an act of self-respect. And self-respect, when witnessed in its pure form, is magnetic. It calls us to examine our own. That's what she gave him in the end, whether she intended to or not. A mirror, and that mirror doesn't distort or flatter, it simply reflects. So if you wonder why men fall harder for the women who let them go, it's because those women force them to grow up emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, not through criticism, but through contrast. And sometimes it takes the absence of grace to realize how much of it you were given. When a woman truly lets a man go, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, something paradoxical happens. Her absence no longer just signifies that she's gone. It begins to symbolize freedom, not just her freedom from the relationship, but his as well. And that's where things get complicated. Because at first, that freedom feels exhilarating. He tells himself he's free to explore, free to focus on himself, free from the friction that perhaps had built over time. But gradually, that freedom becomes something else. It becomes accountability. There's no longer anyone there to absorb his emotional immaturity, no one to redirect his deflection, no one to validate him when he won't validate himself. And suddenly, he has to face the one thing he spent years learning how to avoid, his own internal landscape. You see, while she was there, consciously or unconsciously, she was filling emotional gaps, holding up the walls where he hadn't learned to build his own, offering words when he had none, providing safety he never fully recognized until it was gone. And when she removes herself from that dynamic, not in anger, but with clarity, it leaves a space so quiet, it demands self-examination. This is why men often fall harder for women who walk away with peace instead of bitterness, because she doesn't just exit the relationship, she exits the emotional labor of holding the relationship together. And now, for the first time, he has to carry all of it on his own. The silence she leaves behind doesn't echo, it weighs. And what it weighs down is the ego. The illusion that he was fine without her effort, that he could maintain intimacy without intimacy of effort. Her letting go doesn't just communicate that she's moved on. It communicates that she no longer believes he has the capacity or the willingness to grow in the direction she needed. And that hits a place deeper than pride. It hits a man's potential, because whether consciously or not, most men know when they're not stepping into their full self. They know when they've plateaued in emotional development. And it's in the absence of her nurturing presence that they feel the edges of their own emotional incompleteness. Here's the catch. Her absence doesn't necessarily break him. It awakens him. And that awakening might take time. It might come through isolation or through the contrast of future relationships that lack the emotional depth she brought. But eventually it dawns on him what she was offering wasn't just love, it was guidance. And not the kind you demand, but the kind you earn. And when that kind of love walks away, it doesn't vanish. It lingers, not to haunt him, but to shape him. He begins to see that what she wanted wasn't unreasonable. It was actually essential. A man who avoids depth is not a free man. He is a reactive one. A man without introspection is not independent. He is emotionally outsourced. And when she let him go, she wasn't rejecting him. She was returning him to himself. That realization can be transformative, because once a man confronts the void she left, not as abandonment, but as invitation, he begins to do the real work. The work of becoming the kind of man who could have met her where she stood. And whether or not they ever cross paths again becomes irrelevant, because her leaving wasn't the end of his growth, it was the beginning. So why do men fall harder for the women who let them go? Because those women don't just walk away from a man, they hand him the opportunity to become one.